Today we have some more actual history about a man who arouses such emotions, even to the present day, that his statue was vandalized in 1997 with a sledgehammer by those who regarded him as a cold-blooded murderer. He is known as Tom Quick, and today we will hear about the early events of his life from this book, Tom Quick, the Indian Slayer. This book was published all the way back in 1851 by James E. Quinlan. Tom was born in 1734 and grew up in what is now known as Milford, Pennsylvania, which is in the far east portion of the state, close to the border with both New Jersey and New York. Tom Quick Sr. was a Dutch immigrant, who was one of the first white settlers in the area. Tom Quick's story is somewhat similar to that of Louis Wetzel, who was born 29 years after Tom in 1863 in western Pennsylvania, and he lived most of his life near Wheeling, West Virginia. Like Louis Wetzel, Tom Quick grew up interacting peacefully with the local Delaware Indians, but there would come a day when that peace would be shattered. So here is the story of the arrival of Tom Quick Sr. and the events that made his firstborn son, Tom Jr., vow revenge against the Indians. Not far from the year 1733, a Hollander named Thomas Quick emigrated from the fatherland to the colony of New York, and not long afterwards located himself in Milford, then known as Upper Smithfield, in Pennsylvania. His circumstances and position were nearly, if not quite, equal to those of a large majority of the affluent and respectable Dutch immigrants of that period. Actuated by a spirit of indomitable enterprise, he pitched his tent considerably in advance of those who had come into the country before him, and according to the legendary testimony of his descendants, he was the pioneer of Milford, or Upper Smithfield. At this time, except at Peenpack on the Neversink, the Indians held undisputed possession of the banks of the Delaware and its tributaries, from Milford to the source of the river. Quick was surrounded by them, and probably they regarded him with a jealous eye, as a trespasser upon their territory. If any such feeling existed on their part, however, he soon succeeded in winning their confidence and esteem, to such a degree that they did not openly manifest a spirit of discontent at the proximity of his habitation to their wigwams. As soon as Quick had erected a temporary log cabin, he commenced a war of extermination upon the old forest which covered his domain, and in a short time the air was perfumed with the smoke of the fallow fire, and nothing remained on many a goodly acre, except the blackened and charred stumps of the pine, oak, hemlock, and their giant compeers. Luxuriant fields of wheat and maize and rye succeeded, in due time. The log barn of the pioneer was filled to its utmost capacity with the fruits of his industry. All things seemed to conspire to render him contented with his lot in the wilderness. His labor and enterprise were bountifully rewarded, and his new home was made more pleasant by an occurrence, which forms an important event in this narrative. His wife, who had abandoned the comforts of civilization, and left father and mother, brother and sister to accompany him to the wilds of the New World, and share with him its hardships and its perils, presented him in 1734 with a male child, their firstborn. If we may be permitted to make a draft upon our imagination, it will not be too much to say that nothing more was necessary to make his happiness complete, that the wilderness appeared to blossom with 1,000 beauties, which had never before been observed by him, that his life became one of tender sympathies and kindly actions, that in his joy he did not forget, that he owed all to the bountiful giver of every good and perfect thing, and that his heart was replete with thanksgiving and praise and gratitude. The child was named Thomas, the name of its father. Of course, it was the pet of the household, and was tenderly watched by its parents, who, to use a stereotyped phrase, had the proud satisfaction of seeing it daily develop some new faculty, daily become more beautiful and interesting. The Indians who frequented the house of Quick and found a shelter under its roof whenever they desired it, seemed to admire the fine, healthy boy, and often made him presents of plumes of feathers and other articles. As young Tom grew up, he became an associate and playfellow of the juvenile natives, and learned to speak the Indian tongue with as much ease and fluency as the aborigines themselves. He was taught by the Indians how to take the otter, the beaver, the muskrat, the mink, etc., and by the time he had become of suitable age, he was a skillful and expert hunter. He imbibed at an early period of his existence a liking for savage life, and became attached to the woods and the pleasures of the chase to such a degree that he could never in afterlife be induced to follow except temporarily any calling beside that of hunter and trapper. Young Tom had 2 brothers and the same number of sisters. The names of the brothers were Cornelius and James. Of the sisters, little beyond the fact that one of them became the wife of a man named Solomon Decker, and that the other married a Frances Maggie, is known. One of the daughters was married previous to the tragedy which will be detailed in the next chapter. Thomas Quick Sr. continued to prosper. In a few years he had quite a number of white neighbors, and other settlements were formed in the valley of the Delaware, some as far up as Coshecton and the mouth of the Callicoon. He erected a sawmill and subsequently a grist mill on a stream which flows into the Delaware at or near Milford. He had, in fact, become wealthy, and was regarded as one of the most respectable and enterprising inhabitants of that region. A Dutch school was established in the neighborhood, and James and Cornelius, as well as the daughters, were sent to it. But Thomas had become so much of an Indian in his habits and disposition that he could not be induced to attend the school, and if he did go to it, he made no progress in learning. His brothers and sisters were more successful and advanced so far in the rudiments that they could read the Bible in the Dutch language without skipping many of the hard words. They were also taught the art of writing, so that they could trace without much difficulty the mystic characters which formed their signatures. And they were given a very slight knowledge of arithmetic, which was sufficient for them, as people of their lineage generally possess a spirit of prudence and thrift, which makes them the very best practical calculators of their sphere of life. While the younger children were poring over the alphabet, Tom was engaged in the athletic amusements of the Indians, in trapping, wrestling, jumping, shooting, etc. He excelled a majority of the lads of his own age, and thus excited the envy of not a few Indian braves. Previous to the French War, Tom had traced to their sources most of the streams which empty into the Delaware above Milford, and had become acquainted with nearly all the Indian paths and hunting grounds in the neighborhood. This was of essential service to him afterwards, as it enabled him to waylay and murder the Indians with great facility. Cornelius and James were of an industrious, plodding disposition. They assisted their father in managing and tilling his farm, and in keeping his mills in operation, and if they occasionally participated in the sports of Thomas, they managed to do so when they could not be more profitably employed. While they assisted in furnishing the family with bread, and obtaining clothing and adding to its wealth, Thomas supplied his father's larder bountifully with venison and bear's meats. He would occasionally invade the crystal retreats of the finny tribes, and thus add much to the luxuries of his father's table. Many of the Indians almost lived in the family of the Quicks, by whom they were clothed when naked and fed when hungry. The most pacific relations subsisted between them apparently, and the red man had received so much kindness at the hands of their friends that the latter imagined that they could rely upon their good will under almost any circumstances. Subsequent events, however, proved that they were mistaken. The increasing numbers of the whites and the encroachments made upon what the natives regarded as their own territory alarmed the Indians. The Delaware was a favorite haunt of the red man. Game was found upon its banks sufficient for them, and its waters swarmed with numerous kinds of fish. The bones of their fathers were interred in its most pleasant places, and the members of the tribe and their friends had been in the habit, from remote iniquity, of gathering within the sound of its waters to celebrate their annual festivals. Now the prospect was that the whites would soon occupy the whole country, if some decisive step was not taken, and that the bones of the braves who had been in the spirit land for hundreds of years would be desecrated by the plow of the paleface. It is not a matter of surprise, therefore, that during the war between England and France, the Indians were easily induced to fight against the adherents of Great Britain, and endeavor to drive them back to their old bounds. The Quicks had been kind to them, but, on the other hand, the fact could not be concealed that they were the first who had encroached upon them at Milford, and that they had induced others to locate there. The Indians were anxious to rid the whole valley of the strange, land-loving race, and if this had not been a sufficient incentive, the prospect of plundering a family as opulent as that of the Quicks was sufficient in case the Delaware settlements were attacked, to render the ties of gratitude weak and easily broken. At the breaking out of the French War, young Tom was probably as much an Indian in habit and disposition as any of his old associates. The wild, irregular life he had led, and his early and constant companionship with the natives had contributed much more to the formation of his character than the teaching and example of his father and mother. Even his affection for his parents resembled that of the American Indian. While he was turbulent and not easily controlled by them, his love for them was unbounded, a master passion. Anyone who injured them incurred his undying displeasure, and were in danger of his insatiable revenge. He was a good hater, and those whose admiration is Johnsonian will find enough to please them in the legends of Tom. When hostilities commenced, and it was suspected that the Indians of the Delaware and Susquehanna might favor the French, it gave the Quicks and their friends some uneasiness. The natives became less sociable than they had been, and but few of them continued to visit the whites. Ultimately, they withdrew from the Delaware Valley altogether. The fact was, each party feared and distrusted the other, and the Indians felt that they had been wronged. They had long been dissatisfied with the manner in which the whites had got possession of their lands in the Delaware region. They complained that the English had not given them as much as they agreed to pay for the several tracts which had been sold, and that they generally took possession of twice as much as they bought. For instance, the natives had sold land to the proprietors of Pennsylvania, the boundaries of which were to extend a certain distance on the Delaware or Great Fishkill, and as far back in a northwest direction as a man could walk in a day and a half. To settle the depth of the track, the purchasers procured the swiftest runners in the colonies, who did not stop by the way even to eat while running the line. The expiration of the day and a half found them 86 miles in the interior. The Indians were very indignant at the manner in which the proprietors had overreached them, and were never satisfied that the whites had treated them honestly. The Delawares claimed that they had been wronged in the bargain by which the whites became the possessors of Minisink, and they complained too that the people of Minisink were in the habit of getting the Indians drunk when they came there to trade, in order to defraud them. They frequently talked of driving the whites from the disputed territory, but they were a subdued and crushed people, who had had the spirit of war beaten out of them many years previously by the haughty and warlike Iroquois, at whose mercy they had since existed, and who had imposed upon them the opprobrious characteristic of being the tribe of squaws. For a time they committed nothing but petty acts of hostility. They occasionally murdered or captured a few whites at some of the exposed points, but seemed to spare the settlements. After a while they appeared to have become entirely quiet, but their apparent inactivity was but a prelude to new outrages. The pioneers at first took what precautions they thought necessary to guard against danger, at the same time being very careful to do nothing which would tend to bring upon them directly the vengeance of the Indians. Blockhouses were erected or repaired, arms were provided, and ammunition procured, and the inhabitants felt confidence that, unless taken by surprise, they could defend themselves successfully. The whites, not being molested for some time, began to think that possibly they had misjudged in the matter, and that there was little, if any, danger. Consequently, they became careless and unguarded, and some of the ardent and gallant spirits of the Delaware even sought a more active part in the struggle by volunteering to serve in the army. One or two neighborhoods were thus left almost entirely in the possession of old men, women, and children. Tom, from the beginning of the war, had been induced by the urgent and affectionate entreaties of his mother and the advice of his father to forego his excursions in the woods. He no longer had the congenial company of the Indians, and became almost, if not altogether, domesticated in the family of his father. He now assisted the old man in his work and his business, with his brothers and a brother-in-law. The Quicks, as well as their neighbors, had become almost culpably careless as far as the Indians were concerned. Not infrequently they were in dangerous localities in the woods, and unarmed, thus giving the Indians opportunities to surprise and kill them. It is possible that they presumed much upon the supposed friendship of the Indians for Tom, and upon their gratitude for the many acts of kindness the family had done them. While the Quicks were thus thrown off their guard, the Indians were plotting their destruction. In the hope of regaining their lost possessions, and with a desire to plunder and punish the palefaces, the Indians determined to fall upon and destroy the outpost at Milford. With this object in view, they proceeded to a point near that place, where they halted and concealed themselves in the woods, probably for the purpose of consulting upon the manner in which they should make the contemplated onslaught, or more probably to wait until night to make the attack, as was their custom. Unfortunately for the Quicks, and ultimately for Indians, the former, unconscious of danger, went to this place while the Indians were there. The old man found it necessary to proceed to the riverside to procure hoop poles. Tom and his brother-in-law accompanied him. As they were in the habit of doing at this time, they took with them no firearms. They proceeded leisurely around a point or ridge near the river, not dreaming of the tragedy which was impending. The outposts of the Indians saw them approach, and watched them with eager eyes. Two of the men whom they most desired to kill were unwittingly delivering themselves into their power. The opportunity to slay them was not to be lost, even if the main object of the expedition, the destruction of the settlements, was defeated by a premature alarm, which would enable the inhabitants to defend themselves successfully. When the Quicks had approached sufficiently near, they were fired upon, and the father fell, mortally wounded, a ball having passed through a vital part of his body. The young men, who were unhurt, instantly took hold of him, and endeavored to drag him after them as they fled. From some cause, the Indians did not immediately pursue the fugitives to complete their bloody work with the tomahawk. They probably hesitated until the main body came up. In the meantime, the wounded man and his son had got beyond the reach of the rifles of the Indians. The Indians, however, soon followed, like hounds upon the track of a deer. The young men were at first determined to bear their father to a place of safety, or else die with him. But becoming too weak to go any further, even with their assistance, and finding as the Indians gained on them, that all three would fall victims if he was not abandoned, he exclaimed that he was dying, and told them to leave him and run for their lives. After much urging, they finally left him to the mercy of the Indians. It was well for them that they did so, for the Indians were close upon them, and even without their sacred burden, they were not equal to their enemies in speed. To escape, they were obliged to cross the Delaware, which had been recently frozen over, and the ice sufficiently thick to bear them. To cross in full view of the Indians was extremely hazardous, yet it was the only chance they had for escape. The attempt was made, and before they had half reached the opposite shore, the Indians appeared upon the bank behind them. Now came the most critical moments of their flight. They were within the rifle shot of their enemies, and with nothing to screen themselves from the murderous fire of the yelling Indians, any one of whom could shoot a deer 99 times out of 100 while it was bounding through the forest. Their only hope was to run in a zigzag course, so as to baffle the aim of their pursuers, and to keep as far apart as possible so that possibly the Indians in the haste and excitement of the moment might not fire at both of them. Tom had the honor of being aimed at by a majority of the Indians. A dozen rifles gave their echoes to the frosty air, and he fell, his pursuers shouting with savage exultation, "There lies Tom Quick!" He was soon on his feet again, however, and running as rapidly as ever. A ball had struck the heel of his shoe, and thus tripped his heels from under him. He and his companion were soon beyond the reach of the Indians. The Indians did not attempt to cross the river and attack the settlements, knowing that the whites would be prepared to give them a warm reception. They returned, and after scalping the wounded man, and exercising various other cruelties, dispatched him and held a powwow over his dead body. As soon as Tom and his brother-in-law found that they were no longer pursued, they cautiously crept back near enough to the Indians to ascertain what was going on. They heard the scalp whoop and the rejoicing of the Indians, and it is said that Tom, rendered frantic by their fiendish conduct, swore that he would never be at peace with them as long as an Indian could be found upon the banks of the Delaware. His oath was not violated, and he lived to see the day when he could traverse the river almost from one extreme to the other without encountering an Indian. What rendered the murder particularly aggravating was the fact that the Indians who committed it were among those who had been frequently at the house of Quick, and had always been treated kindly there. According to the ideas of the whites, he, above all others, should have been spared by them. He was killed, however, in accordance with the rules of savage, if not civilized, warfare. But, regardless of the bloody codes of both the Christian and the heathen, Tom thought that his father merited other treatment at the hands of those who had been fed at his table, and who had found an asylum under his roof whenever they desired it, and he imagined that the blood of the whole race was not sufficient to atone for the blood of his father. His father's death rendered Tom an implacable enemy of the Indian to the day of his death. He never forgave them for it, and the principal object of his existence seemed ever afterwards, in peace or war, to destroy them. The young and the old, the weak and the strong of the hated race, appeared to be equally the objects of his vengeance, for he was known to destroy the defenseless women and children of the Indians. He was literally no respecter of persons while waging his personal warfare, as our narrative will prove, and was successful to an astonishing degree in his efforts to revenge his father's death. So that's it for this episode. These were some of the first chapters of this 1851 book by James Quinlan titled Tom Quick, the Indian Slayer. This event, the killing of his father by Indians who had once dined under his roof, was what made Tom into the Indian Slayer, and in the coming episodes of this series, we will hear about some other murders nearby, as well as some of Tom's first acts of vengeance on the Indians for killing his father. This story referenced the Walking Purchase or the Walking Treaty, which took place in 1737. This treaty was based on a 1686 agreement where the Delaware Indians agreed to let the Penn family purchase an area of land from the Delaware River to the northwest for as long a distance as a man could walk in a day and a half. They thought that 40 miles was about the most that could be walked in this time. In 1737, they agreed to allow the walk to happen, and Edward Marshall was able to walk or run 70 miles in the day and a half period. This was almost twice as much land as the Indians had wanted to sell, so they were not happy about this treaty, and they grew to distrust the Pennsylvania government. Let us know in the comments if you want to hear what happens next in the life of Tom Quick. And stay tuned to this channel for more actual history buried deep in the pages of old books. This channel is called Unworthy History because we cover actual history that has been cast aside as unworthy to discuss on history channels on TV. Here on this channel, we keep this worthy history of our ancestors alive by reading directly from old books. If you'd like to support our mission on this channel, then you can join our Patreon page or become a YouTube channel member. Members will have full access to all of our members-only videos, and your contribution towards keeping actual history alive will be recognized at the end of each episode. So if you want to see more episodes like this, then be sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time on Unworthy History.